We all have Eeyores in our lives, people who are negative, people who are always down. No balloons, no pink icing, no here we go around the mulberry bush. How does an Eeyore become a Tigger? Well, first of all, it's most important that people learn to be thankful. Giving thanks to God in all things. This is the will of God for you, what Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 5. Being optimistic, focusing in on what we have and what we don't have. Well, some might say, well, I'm just born that way. Well, maybe you were born that way, but you can grow and become a positive person by focusing in repeatedly on what you have as opposed to what you don't have. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in today. I hope this message will be helpful. You know, when we talk about Thanksgiving, we have many fond memories of that, I think, from our childhood and other times. It was always a blessing for us as we were when we lived in Texas, because we did something different every year. We once went to a Dallas Cowboy football game, and we sat in the worst seats possible at the very highest part of the stadium with it open behind us with all the wind blowing on us. When we got to the stadium, it was 70 degrees. By the end of the first quarter, it was 45 degrees. And I had on a polo shirt. I shivered like I've never shivered before. But I will tell you, the old Dallas Cowboy Stadium had 254 crossbars up in the roof, because I counted them. And I could see them very easily. I went there for the express purpose of watching the cowgirl cheerleaders. We were so far away, I couldn't even see them. But it's fun for us. Thanksgiving is a very special day. But one of the things I want to talk about today is the value of living a thankful life day by day. You know, I have had any number of conversations with people who are just pessimistic. I talked to the children once before recently about Eeyore. No balloons, no pink icing, no here we go around the mulberry bush. Every one of us has an Eeyore in our family or in our immediate circle of friends. Is that true?
Yes.
They serve a very useful purpose for us because we can talk about them. But the point is, you don't have to remain an Eeyore. We think, and sometimes people will say things to me which make no sense at all. They'll say something like, "Well, that's just how I am." That kind of statement is pretty narcissistic when you get down to it. It's saying that I am who I am. I'm not going to change. I'm this way, and you can take it or leave it. That's what that statement, the undergirding of that statement really means. I am that way. And then there are those of us who are so optimistic we hardly ever get discouraged. We know that optimistic people live longer than pessimistic people. That's true. Thanks to God at Thanksgiving. Well, we can give thanks to God, first of all, by singing to Him. Now, the psalmist is saying that sing out your thanks to Him, sing praises to our God. You know, the whole book of the Psalter, the Psalms, were meant to be sung. We're aware of that, right? I remember I went to a church one time and stepped in it right away. I was in a planning meeting and one of the power people in the church blurted out, "Well, I don't see anything in the Bible about praise and worship music." I should have kept quiet. I said, "Well, have you not read the Psalter?" At that point, I became his chief enemy number one. But the truth is, the Psalter is a hymn book of praise and worship, meant to be sung. Singing to Him. Now, let me offer this. Some of us don't have a great singing voice. I'm one of those. But the point is, when a person has a song in their heart, that in fact alone helps a person to be optimistic. Shout to the Lord, shout with joy to the Lord, Psalm 100 says. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before Him singing with joy, acknowledging that the Lord is God. He made us and we are His. Enter His gates with what? Thanksgiving. Go into His courts with what?
Praise.
Give thanks to Him and bless His name, for the Lord is good. His unfailing love continues forever. The unfailing love that David is talking about here is God's covenant promise love. that can never fail. God's promise is indelibly printed on the hearts and souls of the very Trinity that spoke it. God's covenant cannot fail. He promises to love forever. And that should make us very optimistic. Again, let's talk a little bit about this optimist pessimist thing. I've jokingly said I've been accused of being an optimist, but really I was a Kiwanis. You'll think about that later. The point being is that optimism gives life. Optimism gives hope. Let's talk about how we manage our time. Okay? And think with me about this. This is so true. We get together in a group of people, a small group of people, 6 to 8 people. And before, almost in a nanosecond, we start talking about things that don't matter. Is that true? We talk about the weather. We talk about sports scores, which may or may not matter, depending on your point of view. We talk about things that we're managing our time. We're just kind of creating kind of chatter. And almost immediately, if we don't connect with somebody in the room, we begin to play a game called Ain't It Awful? And that is a very common game because people don't connect. And many of us would rather talk about what's awful out there than what's good out there. Is that true? Ain't it awful that Joe Biden became our president? Ain't it awful that Donald Trump won the election? Ain't it awful how young people today just don't want to work? Ain't it awful how our postal system is failing us? Ain't it awful? We play that ain't it awful game 24/7 if we get in a small group with people and we don't go to the next level with our conversation. Meaningful, intimate conversation. Well, the next thing we have here is we praise God by praying to Him. Give thanks to the Lord and pray to Him. Our conversation with God should begin and end with being thankful. Listing out the things we're thankful for. I'm a little embarrassed that Cheryl and Nicole are here today because I'm going to tell the same story I told downstairs. We used to play a game at our house. And we would go around as much as you possibly could in a circle of 3 people. And we would turn to the person beside us and we would say, here's something I like about you. And we'd go round and round and round until we got to the absurdity stuff. And then we'd reverse it and go the other direction. That is life-giving. When we begin to be thankful. You know, I've been listening to Jordan Peterson a little bit lately. Not a whole lot. You know who I'm talking about. He's a psychologist, author, and so forth. One of the things he's talking about is thankfulness. And what he said was so fascinating to me. He said, even when things are difficult, being thankful will help us rise above those circumstances. And he's talking about you and me being thankful. He also says, think about this, we should be thankful for all the uncertainties of life. Because if everything was certain, we'd be bored. We would want to get out of bed in the morning. Uncertainty, he says, creates energy and creates life. And yet sometimes we mull uncertainty as if it's an evil, bad thing. Praying to Him. Listing out for us, let me offer this. If you and I, if we want to become more optimistic, we ought to be singing that old gospel hymn, Count Your Blessings, Name Them One by One. I thought about pulling out the Cokesbury hymnal for that purpose today. Count your blessings, see what God has done. If we begin to name our blessings out loud, we will find ourselves transformed by that. Now, again, pessimistic people don't have to remain pessimistic. It's a choice. And sometimes we don't like that fact that it is a choice. We want to blame it on, well, that's just how I am. Next is by giving to Him. Wow. Give an offering to show your thanks to God. Give Him what you've promised. You think I'm going to start hammering on tithing, right? Well, I'm not going to do that. The point is today, one of the best ways we can express our thankfulness to God is by giving. We are so blessed. We have so much offered to us, handed to us on a silver platter. How we respond to that should be giving. And we do a lot of that here. I'm very thankful for our generosity. The point is, again, I'm not an expert about anything. I don't pretend to be. The point of the matter is this. Isn't there a verse somewhere that says it's more blessed to give than receive? Now let me offer something here that maybe sounds secular even. One of the reasons I give is because it feels good to give. That's just the bottom line. And I don't question anybody's motivation for giving, but I'll tell you this. I am delighted when I have an opportunity to help somebody. And again, I hope you will hear this and forgive me for getting personal. The other day, I was at a gas station. I went there purely to get a bottle of Propel and some peanuts. And I'm standing in line, and there's a young lady getting hammered because she tried to return an item. They would not let her return it, and she had no money. She had no money to put gas in her car to get her kids to school on time. I gave her everything I had in my pocket, which wasn't much. And guess what? I drove away smiling and feeling really good because somebody had been helped. And I often think, if I don't help, who will? Okay? I can't be responsible for how people use their funds. If I give them money, I can't do that. I give it to God, but by giving it to people. And please forgive me if that's too personal. Give an offering to show thanks to God. Give Him what you promised. Look at the next passage here in 2 Corinthians 9. Your generosity will result in what? Thanksgiving to God. How awesome it is to be able to hand out and help other people if you have that means to do so. What a blessing it is. And my next point, sharing my testimony about Him. We all have a story we can tell. The Apostle Paul, let's review his life a little bit. Saul of Tarsus was probably the head of the Sanhedrin. Probably the youngest head of the Sanhedrin in history at that time. He spoke 14 languages fluently. He was educated by Gamaliel, who was the chief philosopher of the day. He was a brilliant Old Testament scholar. He stood by, in the book of Acts, I think chapter 6, watching Stephen being put to death and delighted in that. In fact, it says in that passage, he consented unto the death of Stephen. And the word consented there gives us a clue. The word consented there means voting for it. Some have said he probably cast a tying vote to kill Stephen. The story of him killing doesn't stop there. After Stephen is stoned to death and the radiance of God is on Stephen's face, it says in the text there that basically that Jesus stood up beside the right hand of God, stood up and welcomed Stephen. What a great testimony that is to God's love and Jesus' affirmation. But Saul of Tarsus then goes to Jerusalem and drags people out of their houses to kill them. There's no telling how many hundreds of people he helped kill because they were professing Jesus as Lord. And that was a criminal offense in the Roman world and in the Jewish world. Saul is killing people like crazy. He has this encounter with the living Christ on Damascus Road. And it's interesting too, because what happens on Damascus Road is that he hears this voice from Jesus that says, Saul, Saul, why, I love the King James, why dost thou persecute me? So if you're talking to somebody about the Lord and you take some grief for it, they're not giving you grief, they're giving the Lord grief. That's how we take that. And the point is that here's what Paul does. Everywhere he went, his first stop in every community, practically every community, was the synagogue. And he would review, after his conversion, he would go back and review creation. He would review the law of Moses. He would talk about the prophets. And then he would say, I'm a different person because of Christ. We all have that same story to tell in some fashion. And people are dying to hear it. Thank the Lord, praise His name, tell the world about His wondrous love and how mighty He is. Then 1 Thessalonians 5:18, back to where we started. Give thanks in all circumstances. When a person is hurting and sad and lonely and whatever, and you can actually come to the point where you actually genuinely are thankful, your life will change forever. You can transition from being a pessimist to being more optimistic by giving God thanks for everything in your life. Last week, or whenever you read my brother's name, I got a text message this week from his widow, reminding us to be good people and live thankful lives like Jeff lived. Holy cow. Put me right on my heels. Set me up great for this movie I recommended. Thanksgiving is not a seasonal event. You know, back in the day, William Bradford sailed on a ship from England. What they did is they gave everybody a communal garden. They're all going to work the same garden. He left, went back to England, came back, and the people had almost starved to death. You know that story. Almost starved to death. Well, Bradford saw the problem with what they started, and what he did was he gave every person a plot of land, gave them tools, gave them seeds, and said, if you don't work, you don't eat. They had such a bountiful harvest. They invited the Native Americans to come in and share that with them. That's how Thanksgiving works. As we celebrate our Thanksgiving, our hearts are reminded to help other people. Give thanks in all circumstances. This is the will of God for you. Takes some work to do that. Takes some energy to do that. Takes some emotional pain to do that. But at the end of the day, it is the best pathway possible to an optimistic life. Let's pray together. Thank you for tuning in to Horns Methodist Church today. If this message on Thanksgiving and thankfulness has been helpful, feel free to give us a call at 252-237-4616. We'll be glad to talk with you about this or anything else you might want to talk about. God bless you and have a great week.